There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside power, not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, but the silence of absolute dominion, the silence that falls when every living thing within 100 miles has learned to hold its breath in your presence. Kael Morthis had known that silence for so long that he had stopped noticing it. He moved through his obsidian fortress the way a king moves through an empty throne room, certain, unhurried, and profoundly alone. He was not born a demon lord. That is the part of the story that most people get wrong, and it matters more than anything else in what follows. He was born in a village whose name no longer exists on any map, to a mother who sang while she cooked and a father who repaired fishing nets by the light of oil lamps. He had been ordinary once, he had been warm. But 1,000 years has a way of burying the person you used to be under so many layers of consequence and grief and hardened will that eventually you stop digging. You tell yourself the person underneath is gone. You build your identity out of what remains on the surface, and what remained on the surface of Kael Morthis was formidable and cold and very, very tired. The fortress of Vaelthorn sat at the edge of the known world, which suited him perfectly. It had taken him 3 centuries to build, not with his hands, but with his power, pulling black stone from the earth in great dark sheets, and shaping it with a will that bent reality the way ordinary men bend green wood. Towers rose from it like broken teeth. Corridors ran through it that even his generals avoided, because the shadows in those corridors moved independently of any light source, and the sounds that came from within them were not sounds that human ears were designed to process. The fortress was a reflection of its master, impressive, impenetrable, and quietly, deeply strange. His generals feared him, his subordinate demons admired him in the way that lesser predators admire a greater one, with a mixture of awe and territorial wariness. The human kingdoms to the east had spent the better part of 5 centuries negotiating the precise terms of their surrender, and he had accepted their offerings of tribute with the mechanical precision of a man doing bookkeeping rather than conquest. He did not hate the humans. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing about him from their perspective. He simply did not think about them very much. They were a variable to be managed. They were noise in a system he had long since learned to control. On the morning that everything changed, he was doing something that none of his subjects would have believed had they seen it. He was sitting in the one room of the fortress that no one else knew existed, a small chamber carved into the eastern tower, barely large enough for a chair and a low table, and he was reading poetry. Old poetry from the 3rd century, written by a human woman named Lyra Voss, who had lived near the sea and written about light on water with a precision and tenderness that had, for reasons he could not have articulated, stayed with him across 8 centuries. He kept the book wrapped in dark cloth. He had never told anyone he owned it. He was on the 7th poem when his general Dras came hammering at the outer door of the tower. Kael set the book down carefully, wrapped it with the same deliberate attention he always gave it, and waited exactly long enough for Dras to begin wondering if he had made a mistake before answering. The door opened with a sound like tearing silk, one of the fortress's small theatrical touches that he had installed in his 2nd century, and kept because it still, occasionally, made him feel something approximating amusement. Dras was a demon of the 2nd order, massive, grey-skinned, with eyes that burned a dull copper in his skull like old coals. He was not stupid, which was why Kael had kept him as general for 400 years. He was not brave, which was why he stammered now, visibly calculating the risk of delivering whatever news he was carrying. "My lord," he said, "there is a woman at the gate." Kael looked at him. "There are frequently people at the gate, Dras. That is what gates are for." She came alone, on foot. She carries no weapons that we can detect, no magic signatures, no army behind her. Drath paused, and in the pause was something Kael recognized as genuine bewilderment. "She asked to speak with you, by name. She said she has a proposal." The word proposal hung in the air between them in a slightly ridiculous way. Kael considered it. In 1,000 years of conquest and negotiation and the elaborate theatre of power, no one had ever walked to the gates of Vaelthorn alone and on foot and asked to make a proposal. Emissaries came in delegations with written credentials. Assassins came in disguise. Warriors came in groups. Supplicants came trembling and prepared to offer anything. No one simply walked up and knocked. "Bring her in," he said, "to the east receiving hall and make sure she's offered water. If she walked here, she's thirsty." The instruction clearly surprised Drath, who had been expecting something more dramatic. He composed himself and left. Kael stood alone for a moment in the corridor outside his small reading room, his hand resting on the stone wall, feeling the slight warmth that the fortress's deep enchantments always produced, a warmth like the warmth of a living thing, which was, he supposed, exactly what it was. He stood there long enough to notice that something in him had shifted, very slightly, the way a compass needle shifts when it comes near a new source of pull. It was the first time in 40 years that he had felt genuinely curious about anything. He went to change his robes, not because he was vain, he had largely abandoned vanity around the 400th year, but because he had learned that how you appeared in a first meeting established the terms of all future meetings, and he had not stayed in power for 1,000 years by being careless about terms. The woman in the East receiving hall was not what he had expected, which was itself unexpected, because he had deliberately formed no expectations. She was standing rather than sitting, which he noted, and she was looking at the architecture of the ceiling with the expression of someone trying to determine how something was built rather than someone being appropriately intimidated by it. She was perhaps 30, with the kind of face that is neither beautiful nor plain but rather specific, a face that would be very difficult to forget once you had looked at it carefully. She wore traveling clothes that had seen better days, and her boots were still dusty from the road. She had dark hair that she had not bothered to arrange, and her hands, which were clasped loosely behind her back as she studied his ceiling, were the hands of someone who worked with them regularly. She heard him enter, he had not tried to be quiet, and she turned without the startled movement that most people produced in the presence of Kael Morthis for the first time. She turned as though she had simply been waiting, and she met his eyes with a directness that was either magnificent courage or a complete failure to appreciate what she was looking at. "You're taller than the portraits," she said, "the ones the Eastern scholars paint of you, they consistently underestimate the height." He stopped, he looked at her. "Who are you?" he said, "and what do you want?" She reached into the pocket of her traveling jacket and produced a folded piece of paper which she held out toward him. He did not move to take it. She waited. Then she said, "My name is Lyra. I am what's left of the Order of the Amber Seal, which is to say I am the last of them. The rest were killed 11 months ago by something that was not your army, was not any human faction I can identify, and was not any category of threat that any of our records anticipated. I have been trying to understand it since then, and I have reached the conclusion that you may be the only entity with enough historical knowledge to help me identify it." Kael was quiet for a long moment. "You came to the fortress of the most powerful demon lord in the known world," he said slowly, "to ask for help with your research." "I came to the only place I could think of that had both the library and the age," she said. "Yes. The Order of the Amber Seal," he said, "was dedicated to my containment. Among other things, yes. Your order spent 4 centuries developing wards and countermeasures specifically designed to limit my power. Also, yes," she did not flinch, "I'm aware of the irony. Are you going to help me or not?" He stood there in his dark robes in his obsidian hall in his fortress at the edge of the world, and looked at this dusty, direct, entirely insufficiently frightened woman, and he felt something shift inside him that was not the compass needle feeling of curiosity. It was something older, something he had buried under so much stone and silence that he had genuinely forgotten it was still down there. It felt improbably like the first line of a poem about light on water. "Sit down," he said finally. "You're thirsty. I'll have them bring water, and then you'll tell me everything you know about what happened to your order from the beginning." She sat. She was not particularly graceful about it. She had clearly been on her feet a long time, and she sat with the honest tiredness of someone whose body had earned its rest. She tucked the folded paper back into her pocket, having apparently decided it was no longer necessary. And then she looked at him with those direct, difficult-to-forget eyes and said, "Thank you." It was a small thing to say, it should not have mattered. But in 1,000 years of obedience and terror and elaborate supplication, no one had simply said thank you to Kael Morthis, not with that particular tone, which contained neither fear nor calculation, but simply a genuine human acknowledgement of one human action toward another. He turned away before she could see whatever had just happened to his expression. He went to stand at the window and looked out over the black towers and the grey plains, and the sky that was always above Vaelthorn, a particular shade of deep purple, as though the atmosphere itself had been stained by centuries of his presence. He stood there and breathed slowly, deliberately, the way he had taught himself to do in the early centuries, when managing his power required a kind of conscious regulation that was no longer necessary but that he had kept as a habit, the way you keep some habits simply because they remind you that you once had to work at things. He thought about the Order of the Amber Seal, he thought about what could have destroyed them. He thought about the woman sitting in his receiving hall drinking the water that a very confused demon servant had just brought her. He thought about the poem he had been reading, the 7th poem, the one about winter light, and about how Sarah Voss had written that true light was not the absence of darkness but darkness learning, slowly, painfully, joyfully, to remember what it had always been. He had read that poem perhaps 200 times over 8 centuries. He had never understood it until now, and even now the understanding was not complete. It was a beginning of an understanding. It was a corner lifted on something he had kept covered for a very long time. He turned back to the room. "Tell me," he said, "about the night it happened." And she did. The Grand Library of Vaelthorn occupied 7 floors of the North Tower, and it was, without question, the largest private archive in the known world. Kael had spent centuries accumulating it, not out of any academic ambition, but out of the particular hunger of a person who grew up with nothing and never quite lost the feeling that knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you by force. He had histories in 17 languages. He had scientific treatises from civilizations that no longer existed. He had personal correspondence from 4 separate human kings who would have been appalled to know their private letters resided here. He had, in a locked case on the 5th floor, what was believed by most scholars to be the only remaining copy of the Morhan Codex, a text so old that the language it was written in had been dead for 6 centuries before Kael himself was born. He had not shown the library to a guest before. He was not entirely sure why he was showing it to Lyra now, except that she had described what happened to her order, the silence that fell first, then the cold, then the particular quality of dark that was different from ordinary darkness, more intentional somehow, more deliberate, and he had recognized the description immediately from a passage in a text he hadn't touched in 3 centuries, and he needed the text, and the text was on the 4th floor. And so he had said, "Come with me," without thinking about it, and now she was beside him in his library, and the situation had become, in some quiet way, irreversible. She was not the kind of person who said "oh" in an awed and reverent way when she encountered something impressive. She was the kind of person who immediately started trying to understand the organizational system. He found this more impressive than the reverence would have been. "You sort by origin date rather than subject," she said, running her fingers along a shelf of texts from the 5th century without touching the spines directly. She understood how to handle old books, which was either training or instinct and was, in either case, correct. That's unusual. Most institutional libraries sort by subject. "Most institutional libraries are built for retrieval," he said. "This one is built for context. A text means different things depending on what was happening when it was written. I want to know what was happening." She looked at him, that direct, considered look she had, and then looked back at the shelves. "That's actually a sophisticated archival philosophy," she said. "The Order would have hated it." "I'm aware," he said. "It may also be why my understanding of certain periods is significantly more complete than theirs was." They found the text he needed on the 4th floor, in a section he privately thought of as the problem shelf, books that had no clear historical period, or that described events that didn't fit cleanly into any standard account of history, or that had been written by authors whose existence could not be independently verified. The book he was looking for was bound in something that was not quite leather and was not quite cloth, in a color that was not quite brown and not quite red. It was called, in a dialect of Old Varick, something that translated approximately to the account of the formless, and it had been written by a demonologist named Fenn who had died under circumstances that the book itself described with more precision than seemed healthy for an author to possess about the manner of their own death. He set it on the reading table and opened it to the section he remembered, and Lyra sat across from him and watched him read with an expression of patient attention that he found, to his mild irritation, somewhat calming. Here, he said, turning the book toward her. She leaned forward, read in silence for a moment, then looked up. The silencing, she said, that's what Fenn called it. That's what it has been called in those historical periods where it was recognized, which were not many. It appears rarely, perhaps 4 times in the last 2,000 years, and each time it has been attributed to some other cause by the people who survived it. He paused. The Order was not the first group dedicated to the limitation of supernatural power to be destroyed by it. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her absorb this. The death of her order was not an isolated incident but part of something older and larger and more deliberate than anything she had imagined. He watched her work through the implications in real time, which was something he did not often see because he did not often sit with people while they thought. Most people performed thinking for him rather than actually doing it in his presence. She was actually doing it. The silencing needs something specific to target, she said finally. A concentration of a particular type of energy. Fenn's account says, I'm paraphrasing, that it feeds on organized resistance to formless power. The Order's entire purpose was organized resistance to formless power. We were effectively perfect prey. Yes, he said. And before us the Verdane Circle, and before them the Covenant of the Three Mountains. She looked at the page again, then back at him. And your power it is the largest concentration of organized non-formless power in the current world. You are also perfect prey. That has occurred to me, he said, over the last 11 months while I was trying to determine what had destroyed your order and whether it was moving in my direction. She blinked. It was the first time he had seen genuine surprise cross her face. You already knew about this, you've been researching it. I told you I had the historical knowledge you needed. I did not say it was purely theoretical. You've been worried, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite wonder but was in that territory. You've been genuinely worried about this thing. He considered how to answer. The honest answer was yes, but the word worried sat uncomfortably with the 1,000 years of constructed certainty that he carried in his bearing. He settled on a version of honesty that was precise without being revealing. I have been taking it seriously, he said, which is, for me, the functional equivalent. She nodded slowly, and then to his complete bewilderment she smiled. Not a polite smile and not a nervous smile, but the kind of smile that happens when something actually strikes you as genuinely humanly funny. You have been sitting up here in your enormous terrifying fortress, she said, reading old books and quietly being afraid while the rest of the world has been quietly being afraid of you. That is a gross oversimplification. It is also, I think, basically true. He was silent. He was not, in point of fact, accustomed to being read accurately by anyone. It had happened perhaps a handful of times in 1,000 years, and each time it had produced in him a sensation that was not comfortable and was not entirely uncomfortable, more like the feeling of a window opening in a room that has been shut too long. He did not, in the normal course of events, know what to do with that feeling. What he did with it now was stand up and go to the window of the 4th-floor reading room, which looked inward on the fortress courtyard rather than outward on the plains. And he stood there and looked at the courtyard where 2 demon soldiers were going through a training exercise, and a third was sitting on a stone bench, looking at nothing in particular with the glazed patience that demons who had lived for centuries often wore as a default expression. He looked at all of this, at his fortress and his soldiers and his world that he had built so carefully and defended so thoroughly, and he felt, for the first time in a very long time, that it was perhaps a smaller world than it needed to be. I'll make you a proposal in return, he said, still facing the window. I already made the proposal, she said. I proposed you help me understand what destroyed my order. And I'm extending it. We work on this together. You have the training of the Order, their field methods, their observational records, the things they catalogued over 4 centuries that I don't have in this library. I have the historical depth and the power necessary to do something about what we find. Neither of us can solve this alone. He turned. You can stay here. There are rooms. The library is accessible to you. My staff will treat you appropriately. She held his gaze for a moment. When you say appropriately, as a colleague, he said, not a prisoner, not a guest in the ornamental sense, a colleague. Something shifted in her expression. Again, it was something he had no name for. He had become accustomed in his long life to naming every emotion he observed in others, because understanding what people felt was a component of managing them, but Lyra seemed to consistently produce emotions in herself that he couldn't immediately categorize, which meant his naming system was incomplete, which was itself a useful piece of information. "All right," she said, "then yes, I'll stay." The days that followed were the strangest of his very long life, which was a significant statement. He had lived through centuries of warfare and negotiation, through periods of genuine crisis and periods of absolute stagnation. He had been alone for centuries and had been surrounded by subjects for centuries, and had learned eventually that neither condition was as different from the other as it appeared. But this was different in a way he was still mapping as he experienced it. She worked the way serious scholars work, with complete absorption, which meant that she sometimes forgot to eat, sometimes forgot that she was in a demon lord's fortress and not in a comfortable library somewhere, and several times forgot that he was present in the room until he spoke, and she startled with a small physical jolt that she immediately smoothed over, but that he found, for reasons he could not justify, endearing. The word endearing was not a word he had used about another person in several centuries. She asked questions without apparent concern for whether the questions might be inappropriate. She asked about his age, not how old he was, which most people either knew or were afraid to confirm, but what it felt like, whether 1,000 years felt continuous or broken into periods, whether he experienced time differently than humans did. He answered, which surprised him. He told her that the first century felt very long and the next several felt shorter, and that somewhere around the 500th year he had stopped counting in the way humans count, with the sense of accumulation, of years adding up towards something, and had started simply living in the present of whatever century he was in, the way you stop counting steps when you've been walking a long time. She listened to this carefully and then said, "That sounds like a kind of peace but also a kind of loss," and he had said, "Yes, both," which was more honest than he had intended to be. She told him about the order, not the institutional history. He had documents for that, several of which she found and read with the complicated expression of someone encountering official records of their own life. She told him the human history, what it was like to be trained from childhood for a vocation that most of the world either didn't know existed or thought was ceremonial, what it felt like to believe deeply in something that required you to remain permanently on alert for a threat that most of your contemporaries considered mythological. She told him about her mentor, an elderly woman named Petra who had smelled of lavender and sharp cheese, and had been, by Lyra's account, the most practically intelligent person she had ever known. She told him about Petra with a careful matter-of-factness that he recognized as the way people talk about the dead when the grief is real, and they have decided to carry it rather than display it. He thought about his own dead. He had enough of them to fill several books. He did not tell her about them, not yet, but he found himself thinking about them in a way he had not thought about them in some time, not with the distant archival quality that centuries of perspective imposed, but with something closer to the original texture of the loss. He was not sure whether this was because she had reminded him of what grief looked like in its honest form, or whether it was something else, something to do with her specifically, something that he was not yet prepared to examine directly. What he was prepared to examine was the problem. Together, in the library, working from the Fen text and the Order's records and 3 other historical sources that Lyra found in his collection before he had gotten to them himself, which he noted without comment, they began to build a picture of the silencing that was more complete than either of them had had alone. It was older than any of the individual accounts suggested. It was not a creature or an entity in any recognizable sense, but rather something closer to a process, a tendency of the formless to consume the organized, occurring at intervals that seemed related not to time but to density of organized power in a given period. They were currently in such a period. They had been for about 200 years. "Which means it's not going anywhere," Lyra said on the 4th evening, sitting across from him with a cup of tea that one of the demon servants had learned, through a process of careful observation, that she preferred quite strong. "It will move through this period, taking out concentrations of organized power one by one, until the density drops back below a certain threshold." "Unless it is stopped," he said. She looked at him. "You think it can be stopped?" I think everything can be stopped given sufficient information and sufficient will. He paused. I have the will, what I need is more information. There is one source we haven't used. Which is? The place where it last appeared, he said, 3 centuries ago, the site of the Verdane Circle's end. It is a day's ride east of here. It should still carry traces, residual patterns that someone trained in detection work would be able to read, and that I would be able to amplify. She understood immediately. She did not ask whether it was safe. She asked when they were leaving. That night he sat alone in his small reading room with the book of poems, and he read the 7th poem again. He read it 3 times, and on the 3rd reading he set the book down and sat in the dark without the book and thought about what the poem was trying to say. Sarah Voss had written it about a particular winter morning when the light came in off the sea at an angle that made everything look as though it had been touched rather than illuminated, not revealed, but specifically individually acknowledged. She had said that she had stood in that light and felt, for the first time in years, that she had been seen by something that did not want anything from her. He sat with that for a long time. Then he wrapped the book in its cloth, set it in its place, and went to prepare for the journey. They rode out at first light, which at Vaelthorn meant the particular grey-purple moment when the darkness thinned without fully yielding, a half-commitment to mourning that the region had made for centuries and seemed to genuinely prefer. He rode a black horse that was larger than ordinary horses and carried itself with the slightly unnerving serenity of an animal that had absorbed something of its rider's temperament. Lyra rode a grey mare from the fortress stables that she had selected herself with the practical eye of someone who knew horses and wanted one that would work well over long terrain rather than one that was impressive. He had noticed this and said nothing about it. The first hours of the ride were quiet in a comfortable rather than strained way. He had not ridden beside another person for he calculated without meaning to perhaps 80 years. He had ridden at the head of armies which was not beside. He had ridden alone which was not beside. Beside was different. Beside implied a rough equality of purpose and direction, a shared heading, which was a thing he had very little experience of. Lyra broke the silence not with conversation exactly but with observation. She pointed out a stand of trees to the north that had grown in an unusual pattern, circular, the inner trees taller than the outer ones, which was an inversion of normal growth, and said it was consistent with a containment ward from several centuries ago that had been anchored in the soil and then abandoned, leaving the magic to dissipate slowly through the local vegetation. He looked at the trees and saw what she meant immediately, and felt a small, sharp pleasure at having the explanation matched with the observation, the pleasure that comes specifically from learning something you didn't know you didn't know. You notice things, he said. The Order trained us to read landscape, she said. Every magical event leaves physical traces if you know what to look for. Wards in the soil affect plant growth. Summoning rituals change the mineral content of the ground. Old battlefields between magical forces sometimes have unusual weather patterns for decades afterward. She paused. I notice you have a weather pattern over Vaelthorn that is consistent with a very old and very large working, something you did in the early centuries, I'd guess. The atmosphere is still adjusting. 270 years ago, he said, I anchored a permanent ward around the fortress, defensive. The original working took 6 months and more energy than anything I've done since. He said it without pride, it was simply a fact, a piece of the historical record. I didn't know it affected the weather. The documentation from the Order's observation posts from that period noted the atmospheric change, she said. They catalogued it as an omen. They spent about 40 years arguing about what it was an omen of. She said this with a dry quality in her voice that suggested she had read the documentation and found the debate somewhat excessive. They were very good at cataloguing, not always as good at interpreting. Is that why you joined them? He asked. To be better at the interpretation. She was quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet, not performing thought, but actually considering whether she wanted to answer, which he had come to recognize as a Lyra distinction. I joined because Petra asked me to, she said finally. I was 14. She came to my village. The Order had a practice of traveling through rural areas, looking for children with latent sensitivity to magical fields, which sounds fairly ominous but was actually quite gentle in practice. She found me and she sat with me for 2 days and talked to me about what the world looked like from the inside of something old and purposeful, and I found I wanted very much to be inside something old and purposeful. She paused. I stayed because it turned out I was genuinely good at the work, and because she was the closest thing I had to a parent who actually paid attention. She said this without self-pity, which was, he had learned, her general approach to the harder facts of her life. He found it both admirable and faintly aching, which was an unusual combination. They stopped at midday beside a stream that ran along the edge of a shallow valley, where the horses drank and Lyra produced from her saddlebag a collection of wrapped food that the fortress kitchen had prepared with more care than he had explicitly requested, which suggested that someone in the kitchen staff had decided to make a unilateral effort, which he filed away as an interesting social development. She unwrapped it and distributed it with the practical ease of someone who had eaten many meals in the field and no longer needed a table or chairs to make a meal feel like a meal. "Can I ask you something?" she said, which was a question she used regularly as a prefix and which he had noticed she only used when the actual question was something she was uncertain about asking directly. "Yes," he said. "What was the thing that started it, the path to all of this?" She gestured, a small economic gesture that somehow managed to encompass everything from his power to his fortress to the 1,000 years of history that had accumulated around him. "People don't begin as demon lords. Something happens. I don't know your history, and the Order's records on it they're not sympathetic, and I suspect they're not accurate." He looked at the stream for a while. The water moved over stones with the steady indifference of water, which had never needed to worry about what it was. "I was 31, he said. "There was a war, not a magical war, an ordinary human war, the kind that started over territory and became, over time, something that neither side remembered starting. My village was in the middle of the path of it. There was a night, a particular night, when what was happening required me to make a choice between doing nothing and doing something that I knew, even at 31, would cost me more than I could calculate in advance." He stopped, started again. "I had power I hadn't fully understood until that night. I used it, I stopped what was happening, but the scale of what I did, the energy of it, the raw force of that much power expressed that suddenly and completely it changed me, changed the structure of what I was." He was quiet for a moment. "The people I saved were afraid of me afterward. That was the part I hadn't anticipated. Not one of them could look at me the way they had the morning before." Lyra was listening with her whole attention. He was not accustomed to being listened to that way, fully, without agenda, without the calculating quality that even well-intentioned listeners usually brought to someone with his history. "And you couldn't go back," she said. "You can't unspend that kind of power, and you can't unsee how people look at you when they've seen what you can do." He paused. "So you go forward, you find a way to make what you've become into something that at least has coherence and purpose, even if it's not what you planned." "Into a demon lord." "Into whatever this is," he said. "The title was given by others. I simply continued for a very long time." She looked at him, the direct, specific look that he had begun to organize his experience of her around, the look that saw without judging, that absorbed without processing for advantage. "You were 31, she said. "You saved your village and you've been alone ever since." He did not answer, which was an answer. She looked back at the stream. "I'm sorry," she said. That's a very long time to carry something like that." The apology was genuine, which was what undid him slightly. Not a dramatic undoing, he was who he was, and 1,000 years of self-possession does not dissolve in an afternoon, but something quiet and structural, like a seam coming loose inside him, releasing something that had been compressed against it. "We should keep moving," he said. He stood. He began repacking what he could reach. She stood too and helped with the horses and said nothing more about it, which was, he thought, exactly right. The site of the Verdane Circle's end was a cleared area in a sparse forest, not cleared by human hands but by the absence that the silencing left behind. 3 centuries later, no trees had grown back in the circle where it had happened. The ground was not scorched or charred, it was simply empty. The grass around the edges was healthy and ordinary. Inside the circle, the earth was bare and fine-grained, like ash that had been rained on repeatedly until it lost all memory of what it had been. Lyra crouched at the edge of the circle and placed her hands flat on the bare ground. She was still for a long time. He stood behind her and waited, feeling the residual patterns in the air of this place, faint, old, but recognizable to him as the signature of something that had consumed a great concentration of organized power and moved unsatisfied. It was like standing in the place where a fire had been. Long after the fire, you couldn't see the fire, but you could still understand its shape from the shape of what was gone. It came from below, she said finally, not the ground itself through it, like the ground was just a membrane and it came up through the membrane from somewhere beneath. She looked up at him. That's new, that's not in Fenn's account. Fenn observed from a distance, he said. You're closer to the original than Fenn ever was. He moved to stand beside her and he reached out his own power, not aggressively, not with force, but with the careful probing quality of someone checking the temperature of water. The residual patterns responded to his power the way cold metal responds to warmth, slowly, reluctantly, and then all at once. He read what they told him and was still for a long moment. It doesn't come from below, he said. It comes from between. There is a space between organized systems in the formless regions that exist between every established power structure. It exists there and it extends when the density of organized power exceeds a threshold. The membrane is not the ground. The membrane is the boundary between a coherent power system and the formless space around it. He looked at her. Our libraries, our wards, our organizations. They all create boundaries, and the silencing enters through those boundaries when they're under enough pressure. Then the way to stop it, she said slowly, working it through with him in real time, is not to defend the boundary harder. The boundary is the target. The way to stop it, he said, is to change the relationship between the organized and the formless, not to strengthen the separation, to do the opposite. They looked at each other. In the bare circle where nothing grew, in the forest that had grown around an emptiness for 3 centuries, in the complicated and still evolving territory of what they were to each other, they stood with this understanding between them. That means using your power differently than you've ever used it, she said, not to enforce separation, to create integration. Yes. Can you do that? He considered this with genuine honesty. It was not a question of capacity in the technical sense. He had power enough. It was a question of whether the person he had become over 1,000 years of building walls and drawing lines and establishing the kinds of dominance that required clear categories of inside and outside, whether that person could do something that was structurally the opposite. Whether a demon lord could do what light did, which was not to hold back the dark but to move through it. I don't know, he said. I think the answer depends on factors I haven't fully accounted for. She tilted her head slightly, such as. He looked at her. He did not say, such as what it does to a person to spend a week in the company of someone who is honest with them without wanting anything in return, and to read poetry in the evenings again, and to feel curiosity about something other than the mechanics of power, and to explain your own history to someone who receives it not as a weapon or a warning but as a story, a human story told by someone who is still underneath everything human. He did not say any of that because it was too large to say all at once, and because he was still, in some fundamental sense, himself, and himself did not deliver revelations without preparation. Instead he said, we should return, there is more work to do in the library, and I need to think. She nodded and stood, brushing the fine grey earth from her palms. She looked at the empty circle one last time, a brief, honest look, the look you give to places where something was lost before you knew it was yours to lose, and then she turned toward the horses and walked with the deliberate, practical stride of someone who has grieved correctly and is now moving on to what comes next. He followed. He was, he noticed, no longer precisely ahead. 3 weeks after the ride to the site of the Verdane Circle, Kael sat in the library at 2 in the morning with 4 open books, a pot of tea that had gone cold without his noticing, and the solved problem laid out in front of him. It was a rare experience, the experience of completion, of a line of inquiry reaching its conclusion with all pieces present and coherent. He sat with it for a while in the way you sit with something before you show it to anyone, not from secrecy, but from the desire to hold a complete thing alone for one moment before it becomes shared and therefore changed. Then he went and knocked on Lyra's door. She answered after a short pause in the voice of someone who was awake rather than someone who had been woken. She had been reading too, he suspected, which was a characteristic they apparently shared. She opened the door and looked at him, reading his expression with the facility she had developed over 3 weeks of close work. You have it, she said. I have it, he said. She came with him to the library without stopping to change or arrange herself, carrying a blanket around her shoulders because the corridor was cold. She sat across from him at the reading table and he showed her the work, the synthesis of the Fenn account with the residual patterns from the site, with a 3rd century text on formless energy dynamics that she had found on the 2nd floor 6 days ago, with 2 principles of power integration that he had worked out from first principles using the structural logic of his own power as a test case. It was complete. It was, he believed, correct. She read it carefully. She asked 3 questions, all of which he had anticipated, and his answers satisfied her. She pointed to one passage and suggested a cleaner way to express the 2nd principle, which was better than his version, and he revised it. She sat back. "You know what this means," she said. "I know what it requires," he said. "It requires you to undo it," she said, "not the fortress, not Vaelthorn itself, but the relationship between your power and everything around it. The way you've organized your power for 1,000 years creates exactly the kind of sharp boundary the silencing can move through. To integrate rather than separate, you have to," she stopped. "It would be enormously vulnerable. The transition period would be." "Yes. Weeks, you said, perhaps longer. While the new structure sets, you'd be exposed in ways that nothing with your history has any right to be exposed." "As I know." She looked at him. Outside the library windows, the deep purple sky of Vaelthorn was just beginning to soften at its eastern edge, not light yet, but the memory of light coming ahead. "Why would you do this?" she said. "You could find another way to defend against the silencing. You could reinforce instead of integrating. You'd be less effective against the silencing specifically, but you'd maintain." "I could," he said, "yes." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the window at the softening darkness. He thought about a poem. He thought about a fishing village and oil lamps and a mother who sang. He thought about a night when he was 31 and the world changed, and how he had spent 1,000 years making the world change on his terms because it was the only thing left to do once you couldn't go back. He thought about the compass needle feeling when he first heard there was a woman at the gate. He thought about being sat across from and genuinely listened to. He thought about someone saying thank you as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "There's a poem," he said, "by a woman named Sarah Voss who lived in the 3rd century near the sea." He heard how that sounded, how unexpected it was as a beginning to this answer, and he continued anyway. "She wrote about winter light. She said that light doesn't hold back the dark, it moves through it. It doesn't protect itself from darkness by becoming more solid. It remains exactly what it is and it moves, and in moving it changes the nature of everything it touches." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I have been solid for 1,000 years," he said. "I have been the wall, the fortress, the boundary, and I have been very good at it, but a wall does not change the nature of anything it touches, it only determines what does and doesn't get through. I find that I am no longer satisfied with determining what gets through." She looked at him. In the near dark of early morning, in the library that smelled of old paper and cold tea and the particular dusty warmth of preserved knowledge, she looked at him with her specific and difficult-to-forget face, and her expression was something he had no name for in any of the languages he knew, which made it the most interesting expression he had ever encountered. "Kael," she said. She had started using his name about a week ago without comment or ceremony, and each time she used it he felt something very quietly recalibrate. "There is also a second reason," he said, "because honesty once started has its own momentum, which is that I am not certain I want to spend the next 1,000 years the way I spent the last 1,000, and the prospect of doing this differently, of being something other than a wall, feels, for the first time in a very long time, like something worth the risk." He paused. "You showed me that, I think, not by saying anything about it. Simply by being someone who treated me as a person rather than a phenomenon." The silence that followed was long and was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms when something true has been said, and both the person who said it and the person who heard it need a moment to understand what it changes. "I don't know what I am to you exactly," she said carefully. "I came here for research. I stayed because the work was genuine and because," she stopped, began again, "because I found that I didn't want to leave, which surprised me. I was not expecting to find that staying in a demon lord's fortress felt more like being home than anywhere else I'd been since the Order." "You could stay," he said, "formally, indefinitely, not for the research, though the work is not finished, and your knowledge of the Order's methods would be—" He stopped himself because he was retreating into practical justification and he was aware of it, and he thought she deserved better than that. "You could stay," he said again more simply, "because I would like it if you did." Because whatever this has been over the last 3 weeks, working together, talking, eating meals in the library at odd hours, and arguing about archival organization, it has been the best 3 weeks I can remember, which is a statement that covers a great deal of ground. She was quiet, then she said, "What does it actually feel like to be ready to do this? To change the structure of something you built over 1,000 years?" He considered the question. "It feels," he said slowly, "like standing at the window when the dark is about to become light. You can feel it before you can see it. There's a quality to the air, a kind of tension that is not fear and not anticipation exactly, more like the moment before something becomes undeniable." He paused. "It feels like being 31 again in the best sense, like being at the beginning of something whose cost I can't fully calculate but am prepared to pay." She stood up from the reading table. She crossed to the window where he was standing, and she stood beside him, beside that specifically significant position, and they looked together at the east where the sky was now genuinely lightening, the purple deepening at the zenith while the horizon began to show something that was not quite gold yet but was in conversation with gold. "Tell me what you need from me," she said, "to do this, to begin the integration." "I need someone to hold the perimeter while the transition is happening," he said. "Not combat, the silencing won't move during a transition like this, it prefers the established state, but someone with training in detecting formless incursion, someone who will tell me if the process goes wrong and I'm too deep inside it to see clearly." "Someone you trust," she said. "Yes," he said, "someone I trust." She nodded. "Then I'll be there." She said it simply as a fact with the uncomplicated commitment of someone who had decided and was done deciding. "I'll be there when you do it and I'll hold the perimeter, and if it goes wrong I'll tell you." She looked at him. "And if it goes right?" "Then," he said, "the world will have a somewhat different kind of demon lord than it's used to." "The scholars will be confused," she said. "Terribly," he agreed. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, genuinely laugh, not smile at something wry but actually laugh, and it was the sound of someone who had been serious for a very long time and was happy to take a moment away from seriousness, and it was, he thought, one of the finest sounds he had heard in 1,000 years, which was, again, a statement covering a great deal of ground. The working took 11 days. He did not record every detail of it here because what happened in those 11 days was between his power and the fundamental structure of what he had become, and some things resist documentation without losing their essential truth. What can be said is this. On the morning of the first day, Lyra took up her position at the boundary of the fortress's outer ward with her order training deployed as fully as she could deploy it, her hands on the stone of the wall and her attention extended outward in every direction. And at the center of the fortress, Kael Morthis began, with a precision born of 1,000 years of mastery and a courage born of something much older and more essential, to change. She reported to him each evening during the transition, sitting by his side while he rested in the deep, heavy way that fundamental magical working requires rest, and she told him what she had observed at the perimeter. No silencing, no formless incursion. The world, it seemed, had not noticed what was happening yet. She brought him food, not because he required it in the physical sense during the working, but because she had decided that maintaining the ordinary rituals of eating was important to the recovery of ordinary selfhood, which was a piece of practical wisdom that turned out to be completely correct. On the fourth day he said, from the half-conscious state of deep working, "I keep thinking about the village, the fishing nets." She did not ask what that meant, she simply said, "Tell me about them," and he did, in brief fragments between the long silences of concentration, and she listened in the way she always listened, which was completely. On the seventh day he told her about the night he was 31. Not the version he had given her on the ride, the edited, structured version, but the whole of it, including what it felt and sounded like, including what he had seen on people's faces afterward, including the precise quality of the isolation that followed, which had felt for several early centuries like something he simply had to survive, and which had later felt like something he had simply accepted, and which felt now in the saying of it like something that was finally, gently over. She held his hand while he told her that last part. She did not make a ceremony of it, she simply took his hand the way you take the hand of someone who is working through something difficult, steadily, without pressure, without asking anything of the touch except that it be present. He held on to it longer than was strictly necessary. She did not pull away. On the 11th day, the working completed. He felt it complete the way you feel a wound close, not painlessly, but with the unmistakable sensation of something sealed and whole that had been open and raw. He was lying on the floor of the central hall when it finished, because the last stage had taken his legs from him in the way that extreme magical expenditure sometimes does. He lay on the dark stone floor of his fortress and breathed, and felt his power throughout the structure, not as walls and barriers and lines of defended territory, but as something that moved, that flowed, that held its shape through motion rather than resistance. It was entirely unlike anything he had known. It was like the difference between standing in a room and standing in a river. Both are full of something, one of them is alive. Lyra was beside him within moments of the working's completion. She had felt it from the perimeter. He learned later as a release of pressure, like a held breath finally exhaled. She crouched beside him and said his name and looked at his face with the assessing gaze of someone checking for damage. And then she said, "Are you all right?" And he said, "I don't know yet, I think so, ask me in an hour." She sat down on the floor beside him. She did not suggest he move somewhere more appropriate. She sat on the floor of the central hall in the dark fortress with its changed and changing power, and she stayed there. Later she would say that the hall felt different after, warmer, she said, though the stone was the same temperature it had always been. Not warmer the way a room is warmer when you light a fire, but warmer the way a room is warmer when you open the window and let what is outside come in. After a while, when he could sit upright and then stand and then walk shakily to the window, he looked out at the towers and the plains and the sky that was already visibly beginning to change its signature color, not dramatically, not all at once, but the deep fixed purple that had hung above Vaelthorn for centuries was beginning very slowly to admit other colors, blue at the edges, something that was not quite sunrise but was not refusing to be. "The weather is going to change," she said, standing beside him. "Yes," he said. "The scholars will definitely catalogue that," she said. "Let them," he said. He turned from the window. She was looking at him with the expression he still had no name for, and he had decided somewhere in the 11 days of working that he did not need to name it. Some things are more correctly experienced than categorized. He had spent 1,000 years categorizing. He was prepared to try something different. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the book of poems. There is a line in the 7th poem that I misunderstood for 800 years, and I think I understand it now, and I would like to read it to you if you're willing." She said yes. He went to the eastern tower and retrieved the book from its cloth wrapping and came back with it, and he stood in the central hall of his changed fortress with its changed power and its slowly brightening sky, and he opened the book to the 7th poem, and he read aloud. He read about winter light, he read about a morning on the sea, he read about light that does not hold back the dark but moves through it, that does not protect itself from darkness, but remains exactly what it is and moves and changes everything it touches. He read Sarah Voss's final lines, which he had read 200 times and finally, standing here, understood. This is what I wanted most of all, not to be seen by something enormous and indifferent, but to be known by something that has known darkness and chosen still to remain light. He finished and closed the book. He looked at Lyra. "I'm not," he said, "yet entirely light. I suspect I will not be entirely light for some time. I have a great deal of history, and history has weight, and I am not naive about what I am and have been." He paused. "But I think I am no longer only the darkness. I think there is," he stopped, tried again. "I think something is returning, something from before, something from a fishing village and oil lamps and a person I was at 31 who had not yet been turned entirely into a wall." She took the book from his hands very gently and held it for a moment and then gave it back. "I know," she said. "I've been watching it return these past weeks." She looked at him steadily. "I'm glad I was here to see it." He reached out carefully, deliberately, the way you reach towards something you are afraid of damaging, and then he stopped being afraid of damaging it and simply reached, and she met him halfway with the same directness she had brought to everything from the first moment at the gate, when she had stood in his hall and said, "You're taller than the portraits," and looked at him as though he were a person rather than a phenomenon, which was, he understood now, the thing that had started everything. Not a grand gesture. Not a dramatic crossing of a threshold, just a person seeing a person. The fortress above them was already different. The power that moved through it now was the same power it had always contained, but it moved the way water moves, along the path of least resistance, into whatever shape was needed, neither forcing nor refusing. The purple sky continued its slow negotiation with blue. Far off in the plains, a bird, some ordinary bird, the kind that had avoided the fortress for decades, was singing. The silencing in the formless regions between organized systems found the boundary of Vaelthorn's power and could not enter it because the boundary was no longer a wall. You cannot breach something that yields to you. You cannot consume something that makes room for you and simply continues. The silencing moved around the fortress the way water moves around a stone that has been placed in the current, not stopped, but also not feeding. It had fed on everything it had ever found. It had never found this before. It moved on, the world continued. In the central hall, Kael Morthis stood with the book of poems in one hand and Lyra's hand in the other, and the ordinary bird continued to sing, and the sky continued to negotiate its colors, and he continued, as he had been continuing for 1,000 years, as he would continue for as long as he was himself, but differently now, going forward differently. With the understanding that the path from darkness to light is not a journey from one place to another, but a decision made inside a single person on a particular morning in the company of someone who saw them clearly and stayed. He had been many things in 1,000 years, he would be many things in the years ahead, but he was not alone anymore, and the part of him that had been buried under stone and silence and careful, necessary, ultimately insufficient walls had come back up into the air, and was breathing and was glad.